Okay, may I begin?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so again, like always, I feel like I have too much to say today, so I'm probably not going to be able to say it all. So interrupt me at any point. If I don't say it all today, then I'll try and say I'll try and finish my thoughts on the final lecture. I have one more lecture, I think, in this course. Yeah, one more. Okay. So for the last 2 weeks, we've been discussing, well, this week I have listed text from Jacques-Alain Miller, namely Interpretation in Reverse, which is from the early part of the 1990s, maybe 1994 to 1996. I don't remember the date exactly. And then a text from Eric Laurent, which is a newer text. I think it just came out in the last year, titled Interpretation from Truth to Event. So I'm kind of circling around these texts in one way or another. Okay, but for the last 2 weeks, we've been discussing psychoanalysis then, which doesn't mean that we haven't been discussing psychoanalysis now, which I think is a really important point, because the future of psychoanalysis seems to have already been there in what we've been saying about psychoanalysis then. So it's for this reason that I don't think we can so easily claim that psychoanalysis now is fundamentally distinct from psychoanalysis then, like you have psychoanalysis then and you have psychoanalysis now. It's not so clear. And I think I've been kind of dropping breadcrumbs to lead you toward the future in the last 2 weeks, toward the work that we're starting to do today, so that you might kind of follow these breadcrumbs a little bit. There were hints about the future of psychoanalysis in my sections about psychoanalysis then. And I did that because, well, how do I put it? By the way, forgive me for the drilling. There's a lot of drilling. My neighbors are drilling. There's a lot of drilling going on. I'm not sure why. It's been going on since like 7 this morning. It's really loud. But I was thinking, why did I drop these breadcrumbs in the past, leading you toward the future, toward now, psychoanalysis now? And my answer is, I was thinking about this yesterday, it's because I think I'm a prophet. You know, Prophet. I don't mean it like in an arrogant way, like I'm a prophet. And I don't mean it in a religious way, in a religious sense either. I mean it like in the following way. Prophet, etymologically, the etymology of the word prophet, it means to come before speech. It means before speech. That's what prophet means. To put it even more plainly, I would just say that the latent content of a dream is a prophecy. It's a prophecy of sorts. So it comes before speech. It comes before full speech. It comes before the manifest content. Prophecy is a particular conception of full speech. Prophecy is full speech. It's something that we said that we didn't recognize at first that we said. In that sense, it's a prophecy. It means, let's say it means 2 things. First, it means that what we said in the past wasn't known or appreciated as something that we said, so that we can only recognize it in the future, its importance in the future. When we speak, when we discover in our manifest speech, finally the latent content. Latent content is from the future. And second, it means that we always say more than what we intend to say. We're always saying more than what we say, more than what we intend to say. There's always more in what we have to say, and in what we intend to say, and what we in fact do say. And the job of analysis is to point that out. We speak beyond our own speech. If the idea of the latent content means anything at all, then it means that we say more than what we have said. We say more than what we have said. Okay, so let's get into the technical stuff. Let's claim that the latent content is this signifier. It's a signifier, signifier 1, SF1 if you like, signifier 1 or S1. It's only by speaking, producing all these meanings, signifieds if you like, that we can dig something out of what we once said, finding what we didn't realize that we already said. Signifier 1 is this saying that we didn't realize we said. That's what signifier is. So we get to the truth. We get to the truth of things by speaking about them. For example, like we dreamed then, in the past, we dreamed then, and then now in the clinic, now we speak about that dream from then. And then we get the truth that was there in the dream then. So look, I mean, the clinic refers to the past all the time in this way. We're always referring back to our childhood, to our memories, to our personal biographies, to our histories, and so on. But why? We're referring back then precisely to locate ourselves as subjects now. Sigmund Freud already had a word for this, to describe this relationship of the now to the then. In the 1890s, he named it afterwardness. I'm going to share a quote in the chat. Afterwardness. Afterwardness, he wrote, is a mode of belated understanding or retroactive attribution of meaning to earlier events. That's afterwardness. At some basic level, it means that our clinical futures, they're discovered through interpretations of the past. That's all it means. Like, take a very simple example. One of you talked about it in your presentations. It was an element of the dream processes. You know, you have some elements, there's condensation, displacement, and so on. Well, secondary revision. What does secondary revision mean? What ultimately is secondary revision? Freud says the following in his Interpretation of Dreams book on secondary revision. He writes, I'm going to quote this in the chat again. Can everybody see what I wrote in the chat? If you can, just put your thumbs up. Yeah, okay, cool. Sometimes I write only to one person for some reason. He wrote, dreams which might be said to have been already interpreted once before being submitted to waking interpretation. That's secondary revision. Secondary revision concerns dreams that have already been interpreted once, and then in a waking interpretation, they're interpreted again. So he claims that there is an interpretation and then there's another interpretation. Take note of that. It's really important. If secondary revision means anything at all, it means that now we change the past. Now we are changing then. So if, for example, you say in the clinic, it was my mother, maybe that's what you say. That's your statement. That's your speech, your manifest content, whatever. Maybe you said it on the first day of analysis. You go in, you say, I had a dream, it was my mother. Okay, maybe a few weeks later, your analyst reminds you, you once said that it was your mother. And then you reply, no, what I said was that it wasn't my mother. You changed the past. It happens all the time. So maybe it happens in arguments you have with your partners or your family or something. You know, secondary revision is a real thing. I'll give you another example. This is a better one, I think. If I begin to talk, but I take my time reaching the conclusion of my sentence, then the meaning of my sentence can retroactively change everything that came before. If I say, for example, I really like chocolate, and you immediately interpret this, you say, oh, Duane really likes chocolate. Perhaps you interpreted too quickly, because what I was going to say was, I really like chocolate is something that somebody else might say. That's my sentence. The sentence can keep going on like that. You can keep moving the period at the end of the sentence. You can always retroactively change the meaning of what you said before. The sentence can go on and on and on. I'll tell you a stupid joke. It's a stupid joke that's not going to make you laugh, I promise. Okay, and I'm probably not even going to tell it right. Here's a stupid joke. I promised you a joke. Here's one. A man rushes into a restaurant. Okay, this man is clearly in a bit of a crisis. He's breathing heavily. He's trying to express something to his waiter, and his waiter says, he says to his waiter, waiter, help me, waiter, I need, ... I need. And the waiter is waiting patiently. And then the man continues, waiter, help me, I need a shot of vodka, please hurry. This is a Russian joke. The waiter, very concerned, but also confused, runs into the kitchen, brings out several shots of vodka for the man who's clearly in a crisis. The man in crisis is shooting them one by one, and then sits down and calmly looks back at the waiter. All of a sudden, breathing normal, everything. The waiter responds, okay, so what's the problem? Do you have some pain? Is the vodka to help you with some pain you're having? Are you having withdrawal symptoms? Do you need the vodka to sterilize a wound in your mouth? Like, what's going on? The man responds calmly, if you had what I had, you'd need a few shots of vodka too. And then the waiter leans down and whispers into the man's ear, what do you have? The man responds, only 25 cents, and these shots of vodka cost $3 each. It's a stupid joke. I promised you a joke. It's a stupid joke. The point is simply that the meaning, the truth of the joke keeps getting displaced, keeps getting pushed further down, deferred. The signifier, the letter of the joke keeps sliding around. And it's for this reason that you can always elaborate on any sentence that you say. Any sentence can go on and on. This is why interpretation can be a life sentence. Interpretation can be a life sentence. Life sentence means a prison sentence in America. I'm not sure it does here. So, but to return to my point about afterwardness, psychoanalysis as an orientation is kind of built upon this principle. For example, Jacques Lacan insisted that he was returning to Freud. He's going back to Freud. Return, which means to go back in time to Freud, who preceded him. You know, and in fact, many people today, they still find themselves returning to the past of psychoanalysis in that way. Even in their rejection of Freud, they're returning to Freud. I would say I don't return to the past, I return to the past, which is different. I'm not going to explain what that means today. I'm only saying it for Julie, in fact, who will understand what I'm saying. I'm more interested in the past of psychoanalysis than in the past of psychoanalysis. But in other words, what I hope to prove to you is that psychoanalysis doesn't have to be this life sentence. Lacan, for his part, found a way outside of the prison of interpretation. There's a way to pass beyond the life sentence of interpretation. So, you know, like at one point, Lacan stopped returning to Freud, stopped reading Freud. And I think he stopped returning to Freud at a very important moment in his journey. It's as if he was looking in the past of Freud's work to find what was missing. And then he discovered Freud was missing something in his interpretations, in his work. There was something missing in Freud. There was a black hole there somewhere in Freud's work, something radically absent. And it was perhaps in this place where something was missing in Freud's work. The memes are popping or something. There's in this place where something was missing in Freud's work, this place where there's a black hole, that Lacan found himself. He became Lacan. When Lacan looked down Freud's throat, he found something that couldn't be interpreted. Okay, but what's really interesting to me is that the word prophet, it doesn't only mean before speech. Its etymology doesn't just mean before speech. You know, currently we've been thinking about the prophecies of dreams and Freudian psychoanalysis as the revelation of full speech, which implies that it's in the register of truth and meaning that interpretation aims. So we say, for example, what is meant in your dream is the following, ... The dreamer was dreaming about this. This is the latent content. You heard, for example, last week, Freud gave very precise interpretations to one of his patients in the dream of the woman who chose not to throw a dinner party, for example. He gave a very precise interpretation. He said something like, the dream tells you that you can't give the dinner party, which is fulfilling your wish, something blah, blah, blah. You know, he gave a very precise interpretation. It's a meaningful interpretation. Okay, but although the prophet comes before speech in this understanding, in the Freudian prophecy, the prophet doesn't remain there. Eventually, the prophet returns into speech, into full speech. So when we interpret dreams, we're locating the signifier that's buried beneath the manifest content and revealing this unique constellation of signifiers that determine the itinerary of the subject. Okay, but if you check your etymology dictionaries, you'll notice that the word prophet doesn't just mean before speech. It also means to interpret. Prophet means before speech. It also means to interpret. For Freud and for the early Lacan, the Lacan of the period of the purloined letter, the seminar on the purloined letter, it's clear that the dream's prophecy was revealed in signifiers that determined us, in the symbolic determinations, that it was a truth that we had to confront. Your wish is this. This is what you wish for. You know, Jacques-Alain Miller once said the following, putting it in chat in case you need it. Jacques-Alain Miller once said, truth is coupled with meaning, and the two of them make a trio with fiction, end quote. Truth is coupled with meaning, and the two of them make a trio with fiction. It's a really important statement because it guides everything that I'm trying to say today. I speak a lot. I realize my lectures probably are a bit like a life sentence for some of you. But I promise you there will be an end to it. Okay, you confront a limit. Within Freudian psychoanalysis, within early Lacanian psychoanalysis, in psychoanalysis then, truth, psychoanalytic truth, which is the final aim of interpretation in Freudian analysis to some extent, truth is coupled with meaning. You're delivering meaning. The prophecy of Freud was concerned with the revelation of truth that remained unspoken at the beginning, but would finally be spoken. You would say your truth. You would recognize that you've already said your truth. So the unconscious which determines us is a symbolic unconscious. It's a symbolic unconscious. It's a conception of the unconscious that's structured like a language. Or if you prefer, the dream is structured like a language, like a rebus, a picture puzzle. Okay, so let's see if I can finally begin to move on. I was thinking that prophets, I have no trouble admitting that prophets, there are different types of prophets. There are different singular styles of prophecies and prophets. Not all prophets are concerned with the truth. I'm hesitating for a moment because in Russia, I wanted to say, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll say it. In Russia, there was a prophet. Some people called him a prophet, named Rasputin. You know Rasputin. He was born in Tyumen. He was born here in Tyumen. Maybe not Tyumen, the city, but Tyumen region. And what's fascinating about Rasputin was that he, unlike many other prophets whose biographies are told with great detail and lucidity, Rasputin has an obscure history. His personal history, it's a black hole. I chose the word black hole because it's funny for some of you, but also because it's exactly the expression that was used by a notable historian, Douglas Smith is his name, to describe this absence of any information concerning Rasputin's childhood. Basically, there's nothing there for us to interpret about his past. There's no meaning there. There's nothing for us to know about Rasputin's early biography. The historians have nothing to tell us about Rasputin's childhood. Douglas Smith wrote, I have it in front of me, I'm not going to paste it, that Rasputin's childhood was, quote, a black hole about which we know almost nothing, end quote. So where's the symbolic unconscious in this history, in Rasputin's then? How can we do an analysis of Rasputin if we don't have a childhood history? We do know a few things about his religious conversion, which happened in the late 1890s, I think. He went on some sort of a pilgrimage, a religious pilgrimage, and this was what initiated his religious conversion. But nobody knows why he went on the pilgrimage, what motivated it, and everybody wonders, why? The cause is missing. The consensus seems to be among historians that he fell into some sort of an emotional crisis, some sort of a crisis, and for some reason this crisis pushed him toward a pilgrimage. That's all we know. The crisis, we don't even know what the crisis was. We just know there was one. Well, a pilgrimage is a life's journey, which is different from a life sentence. So he was a different style of prophet. How would you interpret his history? You can't. There's no truth waiting to be discovered, to be said. So we have to adjust. We either have to adjust our definition of truth, completely subverting Freud, which I'm not willing to do, or else we need to admit that that there's such a thing as truth, yes, but Rasputin demonstrates that there can also be a hole in our histories. And these are perhaps two different things, truth and whole. I was reminded also yesterday in a conversation with Julia in a working group that we're in, and a Lacanian working group that we're in, that the sociologist named Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, many of you probably have heard of him. He popularly made this distinction between what he called ethical prophets and exemplary prophets. Ethical and exemplary prophets. The ethical prophet, and this is my interpretation of Weber, this isn't Weber's words. The ethical prophet is the one who somehow touches the determination of the signifier upon the itinerary of the subject. Somehow is expressing a truth, a determination. The prophet has a duty, he's determined by God. It's like being determined by a signifier. When you can admit that there's something missing within the field of language, but that finally you can say something about what's missing in language, you're within the field of truth. That's why Lacan said in his early teaching, I always speak the truth. He said, I always speak the truth. It wasn't an arrogant claim. It also wasn't a religious claim. I always speak the truth, he said, not the whole truth because it's impossible to say it all. It's exact words. I always speak the truth, not the whole truth because it's impossible to say it all. Truth is always on the side of language, on meaning, with meaning, it's coupled with meaning, even if it locates what can't be said. It's for this reason that Lacan and Jacques-Alain Miller described the lying truth. The lying truth. There's no truth. Even Freud maintained this, that says the whole truth. The truth is always in the form of a lie, in the mistake, in the error, the slip of the tongue, the bungled action, and so on. Truth lies. If I said this in one of my classes before, if you have a friend, for example, who says, I always tell the truth, he's a liar. Nobody always tells the truth. There are certain classes of people who believe they always tell the truth. But nobody always tells the truth. It may even be what's most interesting about humanity is that we lie and that we tell the truth through lying. But if you have a friend who says, I always lie, in some sense, it's a very honest friend. I always felt like I could trust people who just tell me off right at the very beginning, I'm a terrible human being, I'm a liar, all this stuff. You say it at the beginning and it's like, wow, this person's telling the truth. It's bold, it's courageous. Lacan said truth has the structure of I nearly said friction, and I like that word too. Truth has the structure of a fiction. A friction, I suppose I would add, that would be my ad based on my slip of the tongue right now. See, the truth came out. Precisely because truth is a friction, it's hard to say it, we resist. But it can be said, truth has the structure of a fiction. I was talking about the ethical prophet. The ethical prophet is the one who comes before speech and interprets. That's why the ethical prophet is always on the side of truth in religious traditions. For the ethical prophet, there's something like a congruence of truth and speech. Afterwardness demonstrates that the subject is determined in the past by the lies that you make today. That's the truth of the subject. So the question then that I was thinking of was Rasputin the style of prophet who revealed the determination of the signifier? Was he revealing some latent content? Was he interested in what in psychoanalysis we call the category of truth? It's not clear to me. What we know about Rasputin popularly, and I ask people all the time what they know about Rasputin, and it's funny what they say they know. It's nothing. They know nothing. What they know basically is that he enjoyed himself publicly. He enjoyed himself. He transgressed sexual norms. He enjoyed himself. It's public knowledge. He enjoyed himself quite publicly. It was even considered by some people an insult to speak about the way in which he privately enjoyed himself, yet everybody said it. And it didn't stop Rasputin. He kept doing it. Sexual activities and drugs and stuff like that. And he used his enjoyment precisely to his advantage. He used it to make something of himself to others, to become part of a ruling apparatus in Russia. So there are ethical prophets, but there are also what Max Weber called exemplary prophets. The exemplary prophet doesn't necessarily or primarily have a relationship to truth. It's not the point of the exemplary prophet. The exemplary prophet may have some relationship to the truth, but it's not an essential feature of that of that type of prophet. The exemplary prophet demonstrates a way of living, a mode of being, a way of enjoying, perhaps. I would even say the exemplary prophet demonstrates how to make something of your enjoyment, of your symptoms. It's about living your prophecy in the world, putting it to use in the world, to make a bond, a social bond with other people. I mean, look, Max Weber's classic example of an exemplary prophet was Buddha, the Buddha. Some people say the Buddha. Well, in the seminar last week, we were saying, I told you that Lacan said, Miller said, desire is its interpretation. Oh, sorry, Lacan said it and Miller said it. Desire is its interpretation. That was psychoanalysis then. Well, with Buddha, we have the following. You know what Buddha said? Blow out the flame of your desire. Blow out the flame of desire. To be even more clear, in Buddhism, there's a type of Buddhism called shunyata. Shunyata Buddhism. Shunya in Sanskrit, but also close to Arabic, it means zero. Shunya. Shunyata Buddhism, the idea is to face the black hole directly. You look at it directly. So the debates in Buddhism are really interesting because what happens in different schools of Buddhism is when they face the void, they argue with each other, the different schools. They say, is it a positive void or is it a negative void? Is it what Lacan called lack, which is within the domain of truth and language, or is it what we're now calling a negative void, a hole, a black hole? I think it's an interesting counterpoint to the prophet and that notion of truth and interpretation that we've been dealing with. Okay, I want to take a detour, short detour. Everything's a detour, I guess. But I just wanted to say something about death, because I think it's important for the future. We can open up a question about whether or not death, as in death drive, is negative or positive. It's a really interesting question. What did Lacan say? He said that the signifier, the symbolic order, is the order, properly speaking, of death. And for what reason? It's because the signifier kills something. You know, like take for example, what we already know from this class, Ferdinand de Saussure. He quite literally said, let's kill the referent, the thing in the real world, the cat that'll actually scratch you. Let's psychologically kill it. We're not interested in the referent. We're only interested in the signifier and the sign and the signified, which circulate within our minds, essentially. We're not interested in real things. The sign, the word, kills the thing. The signifier, the symbolic order, it kills the thing. It's from Hegel, a German philosopher. He said the word is the murder of the thing, or the concept is the murder of the thing. It's for this reason that death drive for Lacan is always connected with the symbolic order in my interpretation. I'm going to quote a psychoanalyst whose work I think is really interesting. Her name is, I'll write her name too, Marie-Hélène Broussais, who wrote, I'm putting it in the chat. Death is always connected to the symbolic order. That is why the drive, death drive, is defined by this order. Sorry, that is why the drive is defined by this order, is the death drive. It's an incomplete sentence. That's why it's not fully making sense, but you get the point. So there's a connection of the symbolic to death in the sense that death drive is about signifiers that recirculate, that repeat. The drive is a signifying network of signifiers, S1, S2, S3, S4. Julie, for example, Julie from our class reminds us in one of her really, I think, groundbreaking essays that you can all read if you're interested on the Stasis Journal website. Julie reminds us that death drive, in this essay, quoting, she writes, death drive is a compulsion to repeat that overrides the pleasure principle. It's a compulsion to repeat that overrides pleasure, to put it simply. Okay, so in this conception, based on what we learned from the latent content, from the dreams, from dreams that repeat in the same night, for example, dreams that repeat in the same night are the same dream. It's the signifier, it's the letter, it's the symbolic that repeats. Death drive's on the side of truth. What's interesting is that the death drive in Freud's conception repeats precisely to establish a substitute satisfaction. Death is a satisfaction in support of life for death drive. You know, it's precisely because of death, self-destruction, the renunciation of your wishes and your desires and so on. It's for exactly that reason that you can continue desiring. Thank you, Julie. I'm going to share with you something from Lacan. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, and I hope everybody's able to hear it.
Managing your projects.
This is Lacan. It's a very short thing. You can see my screen. Can you put your thumbs up if you can see my screen? Yes, okay. Thank you, Deno. I'm just waiting for the advertisement to stop brainwashing us. Okay, I hope you can hear it. If not, I think there are subtitles at the bottom. This is Jacques Lacan talking about death.
La mort est du domaine de la foi. Vous avez bien raison de croire que vous allez mourir, bien sûr. Ça vous soutient. Si vous n'y croyez pas, est-ce que vous pourriez supporter la vie que vous avez? Si on n'était pas solidement appuyé sur cette certitude que ça finira. Est-ce que vous pourriez supporter cette histoire? Néanmoins, ce n'est qu'un acte de foi. Le comble du comble, c'est que vous n'en êtes pas sûr.
Right. The translation's a little off. He didn't say a leap to faith. Somebody imposed that. That's an expression taken from a philosopher named Kierkegaard. Is my screen still sharing? Thumbs down if it's not sharing, please. Thank you. Okay. He said it's an act of faith, not a leap of faith, which is different, an act of faith. But nonetheless, you get the sense. So my question, it's a rhetorical question. I don't want you to answer it, but my question to all of you is the following. What other than truth, other than death, repeats. What of death itself, of what is most real of death, not imaginary that sustains you, but most real of death, intrudes, cannot be interpreted, cannot be deciphered on the side of life, on the side of meaning, on the side of truth. The answer is jouissance. Jouissance. Okay, but I'm gonna continue a little bit before I can develop that. There are prophets and there are also saints, S-A-I-N-T-S, a prophet and a saint. The saint is often quite different from the prophet. The prophet comes before speech, interprets, can be ethical or exemplary, but a saint, on the other hand, perhaps has no relationship to communication, speech, two-body communication, interpretation. You know, in Lacanian thought, we often use the word saint homme, S-A-I-N-T-H-O-M-M-E. Home means man, saintly man, which sounds like symptom, saint-homme, saintly man. There's even a saint that fascinated Lacan, Saint Thomas. They called him Doubting Thomas. Precisely because he didn't believe in Jesus, we're told. So we talked today, in the last 20, 30 years, about the incredulity toward metanarratives as the definition of postmodernism. I don't know if you've heard this. Incredulity, which means a lack of belief. You don't believe in something. Incredulity toward metanarratives. But for a long time, we talked about Saint Tom had an incredulity toward religious metanarratives. And I think there's something here really worthy of our attention, because the prophet is about interpretation, but the saint in this conception is about something else. Doesn't believe in maybe the unconscious, the symbolic unconscious, in his analyst's ability to cure him, whatever else. It's for this reason I finally want to start doing a closer reading, finally, of Jacques-Alain Miller's text, Interpretation in Reverse. And the first thing I wanted to note is that for Freud, you remember the dream was thought to be the royal road to the unconscious, but that was earlier Freud. That was Freud then, and not later, future Freud. Freud stopped talking about dreams. The dream book was in 1899, 1900. He abandoned his discussions of dreams. Few Freudians will ever mention this, but it's true. Why did he stop talking about dreams if it was the royal road? It was as if he had an intuition about the limitation of dreams as a model for thinking about psychoanalysis. We often think of dreams as prophecies. Long before psychoanalysis was on the scene, we thought of dreams as prophecies. Yusuf in the Quran was a dream interpreter who got that gift from God, for example. It's been around for a long time, the idea of dreams as prophecies. But if they're prophecies, then they demand meaning, they demand interpretation. We can define the dream work to mean the dream is its own interpretation. It demands interpretation, and it is its own interpretation. Freud even began to write about symptoms and less about dreams for this reason. What did he say about symptoms? In 1900, he wrote about dreams. In 1920, 20 years later, he wrote all about symptoms, particularly in a text titled Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety. The entire text, long essay, offers a really precise theory of symptoms, not of dreams. What is the symptom? What is the role of the symptom in psychoanalytic treatment and so on? But if you search the text, you'll realize in this text, Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, he never once uses the word interpretation. Instead, Freud claims that when we're talking about a symptom, what we realize is that what he called our instincts, we're not going to discuss this word today, but our instincts, they can't find an outlet. They can't seem to find a mode of expression, so they come out in symptom formations. So a symptom for Freud is a type of substitute satisfaction. It's a satisfaction that we can bear in waking life. If a dream is the expression of wish fulfillment, a symptom is an expression of a substitute satisfaction. A symptom then is conceived almost as like a form of enjoyment. We enjoy, it's our satisfaction. We enjoy our symptoms. We get some pleasure from our symptoms, even though we suffer from them. It's pleasure that we can't do without, but we can't also live with, yet we repeat it. Aaron Schuster, in his book, The Trouble with Pleasure, wrote, I'm putting it in a chat, because I think it's one of the clearest sentences I read on this. He wrote, "To enjoy your symptom means to no longer seek to get rid of it or master it, but rather to live with it. It's a way of living, a mode of life, a mode of being, a centum, which is different than a prophecy, who's got a duty to truth." So in this sense, a symptom, according to this definition, repeats in terms of satisfactions. Okay. The point is simply that Freud abandoned the dream model, but used it as a platform upon which to think about symptoms. Lacan, for his part, discovered when he was interpreting Freud's concept of symptoms that there was something within the symptom that doesn't demand interpretation. It doesn't want to be interpreted. A satisfaction is not always a call for interpretation. There are symptoms that have nothing to say to you and nothing to ask from you. They're not called out to others. You're not trying to get love from somebody, for example, or attention. So for example, there are symptoms that are purely at the level of satisfaction, which means at the level of enjoyment. You look into the history of the symptom, and eventually you arrive at the radical core of the symptom, which is something that refuses to be interpreted, yet keeps repeating. It's a type of enjoyment that repeats, different from death drive. So I'll give you an example again from a comedian. I think I've told it before, Norm Macdonald, from a Canadian comedian, about alcoholism. You know, he said, if alcoholism is a symptom, what is the interpretation of being an alcoholic? The joke goes something like this. It's not funny, remember, but it's the point of it is important. He says to his friend, look, I know you have a disease and everything. You're an alcoholic, which is of course repeating drinks over and over again. But I think you have the best disease. That was his joke. You know, because some diseases you're bleeding in your bowels and your intestines, you know, but alcoholism is a disease of enjoyment. Interpreting alcoholism more often than not, it doesn't make the symptom go away. You probably know this. Many people go to Alcoholics Anonymous programs in America. They go into therapy and so on. They're interpreting the symptom. Oh, you know, when I was a child, I wanted love from my mom. I didn't get it, but I got it from my bottle, my baby bottle, you know, so now I like the bottle. Okay, sometimes these interpretations even help. It's true. They can be effects. They can be effects on the severity of the symptom and so on. But what the evidence seems to suggest is that more often than not, after a person leaves therapy, after a person exits group therapy, Alcoholics Anonymous, the symptom returns again anyway. The symptom returns. It's a return. Interpretation doesn't work. So, put simply, it's the claim of Jacques-Alain Miller that psychoanalysis then was about interpretation at the level of truth. It was aimed at the symbolic unconscious. But now, I found this footnote from Freud, a little breadcrumb, where he claimed that interpretation aimed at the singularity of the dream work and not essentially at the revelation of the latent content as truth. So another way to say that it aims at the singular way in which the dreamer enjoys as such is to say interpretation now aims not at truth, but at enjoyment. You know, this footnote from Freud, it means, I take it to mean that the singular, which is what he sort of said interpretation ought to aim at, just in this one part of the book, it aims at the way a dreamer enjoys, satisfies, wishes. It's a move, we're moving from a wish, which is a desire that's lacking in waking life, but you get it in your dreams. You move from the wish toward a satisfaction, towards jouissance. So Miller claims that the age of interpretation is behind us, which means then, in the past. It's a claim about psychoanalysis then. So we need to be careful though, because I don't think he's claiming that that we are completely abandoning the notion of interpretation, because we're not. He's simply shifting the aim, the goals of interpretation. You know, if interpretation once aimed at meaning and truth, it now aims at something else, enjoyment, something else. So he's not abandoning the entire approach. In fact, he's not, I wouldn't even say he's trying to get rid of interpretation. I think he's rescuing the category of interpretation by interpreting interpretation. He's rescuing it. He's giving it a new scope, new aims, and so on. It aims not at meaning, but at the event of jouissance, the eruption of jouissance. Okay, so he says we have to interpret the age of interpretation. He is interpreting interpretation itself. It sounds like something a young student would write, thinking they're really clever. Oh, I'm going to interpret interpretation. But there's something to it. You know, when you redouble the terms in this way, one becomes a noun, one becomes an adjective. When you double the terms in this way, interpreting interpretation, it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. Like, for example, if I say, I think you're beautiful. I think you're beautiful. And then you say to me, well, I think you're ugly. And then I repeat, beautiful. The second time I say beautiful, it means something different. I'm being sarcastic. Like, I meant it sarcastically, that everything that came before was terrible. It carries a different meaning when you say it the second time. So similarly, interpretation in a different context means something different. To interpret interpretation is not to add more meaning or truth to your life sentence. Interpretation today, in fact, puts an end to the life sentence. You're free from the prison of infinite interpretations and meanings. You're free from the prison of desire. We can blow out the flame. Okay, but the next step is really important because, you know, in our naive model, we said that psychoanalysis interprets the unconscious. In fact, it's not true. What interprets in this conception of signifiers is not the psychoanalyst, the unconscious. The unconscious is what interprets. Dreaming is interpretation. It is its own interpretation. The psychoanalyst is not interpreting. The dreamer is interpreting. We put it, Jacques Lemaitre put it very, very precisely. I'm quoting in the chat. He said, I'm not sure if he wrote it or said it, interpretation is the unconscious. Interpretation is included in the very concept of the unconscious. That's what it means to say desire is its own interpretation. Desire is its interpretation. So what is interpretation? You know, let's say I have a dream of birds, an umbrella, and maybe I want to decipher that somehow. My interpretation is to decipher that. Interpretation reveals the meaning. Maybe the meaning is if I'm dreaming of birds and an umbrella, maybe the meaning is, so it's displaced. Maybe the meaning is I need to bring it together. I want to be free from all obstacles, all storms. I want to fly like a bird or something. I don't know, whatever. I got a meaning from it. The latent content introduces this new meaning. So if something was condensed, I was able to reverse it, to displace it. And if something was displaced through interpretation, I can condense it. So that's, I mean, interpretation is already doing condensation and displacement, which is what the dream has been doing. We're doing the same thing when we talk naively about interpreting the latent content. You're using condensation and displacement, secondary revision, and so on. You're using the same things that the dreamer uses to distort the dream. Condensation, representation, secondary revision, displacement. These are interpretations already. That's the point. The unconscious is an interpreting machine. That's why poets use condensation and displacement, metaphor, metonymy. They're interpreting the world. You don't need an analyst for that. We are endlessly already interpreting our realities. Psychoanalysis today, now, says this, that we're always interpreting. It's the problem we're up against. That's our life sentence. Desire is always a desire, to go on desiring, to keep desiring, which means to keep dreaming. We want to keep dreaming precisely to go on dreaming, keep desiring, keep interpreting, keep ciphering, deciphering, displacing, condensing, weaving something together of the dream work. Jacques-Alain Miller summarizes it in the text in the following way. He says or writes, quote, "It is a lure and even an impasse to unilateralize interpretation on the side of the analyst, the psychoanalyst, as his intervention, his action, his act, his statement, his saying. People have probably been too fixated on the speech act of the analyst to notice the equivalence I mentioned between the unconscious and interpretation," end quote. So Miller, he even boldly claimed that those who held on or still hold on to that then conception of psychoanalysis, the Freudian unconscious, the Freudian understanding of interpretation, the symbolic unconscious, and so on, these people, he says, are narcissists. They're narcissistic, he says. I'm quoting him. "Analytic theories of interpretation merely attest to the narcissism of the analyst." Oh, you're dreaming that you want to be free. He's saying, if your analyst says that, they're a narcissist. But be careful, because it doesn't mean that interpretation like that doesn't happen in the clinic, because it does still. And there's even a place for it. We're just trying to strongly critique it so that we can think a little differently. So if the unconscious interprets, then the interpretation of the unconscious comes first, and then you have psychoanalytic interpretation. You know, it's a chronology. First, there's unconscious interpretation, and then there's psychoanalytic interpretation, secondary phenomena. He's not suggesting we give up on analytic interpretation. He's just suggesting that we have to be aware that it's not the only interpretation that's happening in the clinic. So it's a question then of what differentiates the psychoanalytic interpretation from the interpretation that's already happening among dreamers, among the unconscious, among patients, among all of us in our everyday lives. What's the difference? We know that the unconscious interprets on the side of signifiers and meaning. What about the analyst? Every time you say your dream means this, ... what you're doing is you're extending the life sentence. You're extending the prison sentence of interpretation indefinitely. You're letting the prison of interpretation go on, and you keep people in their prisons, in their dreams, in their caves. Once we admit that the unconscious interprets, then we're forced to think differently about the role of the psychoanalytic interpretation. It means that the ciphering and deciphering cannot be what interpretation is ultimately about as a psychoanalyst. Miller implies that we have different styles of interpretation then as a psychoanalyst. If they're not at the level of meaning, what are they? Well, I'll give you a few examples. Silence is an interpretation. Maybe your patient is expecting you to say something, you say nothing at all. Silence. Is there meaning to it? Not directly. Resonance. When you say words that mean multiple things, that resonate, that you know are important to the person who's going to hear the word because they keep repeating that word. If I say symptôme, it sounds like symptom, but I said it differently. You're using particular words and sound signifiers of the patient to resonate for them because you know that it's an important word that produces some sort of an effect upon them. You can allude to things without stating it directly. Allude to things. You can imply things. You can quote. You can be enigmatic. You can half say something. You can interrupt. You can cut a session when you know the patient wasn't expecting you to end it. You know, if we didn't have such crazy rules here in the university, I would be ending lectures at very particular moments to produce an effect. Okay, so interpretation is in a different key, a more tragic key. And then Miller said something that really resonated for me. I think maybe even just for me alone. He said, I'm going to put it in chat again, in the chat here. He said, the unconscious interprets, and the analyst, if he or she interprets, interprets in its wake. I admit this just resonates for me. He wasn't talking about waking up or anything, but the word wake resonated for me. It resonated even though it was enigmatic, it resonated for me. And maybe it resonates for all of you too, given what we've been talking about in this course. That's resonance. What could wake mean in this context? Well, the word wake was used and it resonates. To interpret means that you're sleeping. The sleep must go on. The dream must go on. I'm living the dream. The show must go on. To the word wake, analytic interpretation interprets the sleeping state in its wake, which means finally it wakes it up. The dream, which is the royal road to the unconscious, is paved also well into the waking state. You're dreaming in waking life, which means that you're interpreting in waking life too. You're interpreting your professors. You're trying to figure out what makes sense, what doesn't. You're fact checking them. You're fact checking yourself. Your professors are checking your meanings and so on. So when we're interpreting in waking life, you're still dreaming in a sense. You're still asleep. But to interpret in its wake is to interpret in the places where the unconscious wakes itself up. And when does the dreamer wake up? When there's no meaning. That's when the dreamer wakes up. When S1 has no more signifieds, S2s, when it can't form a couple with meaning, with truth, with S2. When S1 stands all alone, you have a word and you don't know what it means. You have a sound, it does something to you, you don't know what it means. The analyst cuts S2 away from S1. Analytic interpretation is meant to wake us up, like an alarm clock. We often want to go on sleeping. So the unconscious interprets and it wants to be interpreted. It wants to say something. What's interesting is that deciphering is really just another form of ciphering. It's even the most difficult form of cipher, because a cipher is something, when you decipher it, you take it to be the reality that was hidden there, the latent content, the reality, when you decipher a code or something like that. But it's such a strong cipher that you don't even know it's a cipher. Like an example, maybe it's a stupid example, but in all of this course, let's say I was speaking to you quite frankly, and then suddenly you wake up and you realize that I've been dropping little codes all throughout the course. Codes that could be activated in the future, maybe in other courses and so on. Codes that take on new meanings, new values quite suddenly that you weren't expecting them to. Certain codes, certain words that resonate for you, maybe not for all of you. It's a higher level cipher. The dream is a cipher. It distorts your dream thoughts. And then you wake up by deciphering it to continue dreaming, which means that you wake up into a reality that you believe in. A much more difficult cipher to break is reality. Miller puts it like this. To interpret is to cipher, and to decipher is to cipher again. Okay, let's try and move a little bit in a different direction, a little bit. Lacan went a little further too. He also talked about fantasies. So we have dreams, symptoms, fantasies. You know, because with a symptom, you can still say that there was a signifier maybe trapped in the body, like you have hiccups or you have a headache. Like many of Freud's earlier patients, they had headaches, they had hiccups. And maybe you interpret it. You have a hiccup in your life. Hiccup means an obstacle. So you interpret the word hiccup. And then maybe the hiccup goes away. That's why Lacan claimed that for many neurotics, he called them hysterical neurotics, they have signifiers trapped in the body. You know, why is it that, I'm not saying this is true, but why is it that my mom only seems to have headaches when she doesn't get what she wants? Or why is it that my mom only seems to have headaches at these particular moments? You know, there's signifiers trapped in the body. It's a symptom that once you interpret it, the headache can go away, something like that. The idea is that you should release these signifiers from the body into speech. And then the symptom goes away. You exchange the symptom for words. You know, even with addiction, for example, Some people still believe that there's an inability, it's about an inability to speak about the pain you had in childhood or something. You know, so like the idea is you suffer not from addiction, but from addiction. Addiction. Is a prefix meaning without. Diction means speech. Addiction. So they're suffering from addiction, not addiction. So the idea is there's no speech, so you have symptoms. So with speech, the symptoms can disappear. This is even the whole model of therapy for most people. Talk to me, talk about your problems, we'll get through it. And Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Duane, I'm an alcoholic, and it's been 5, you know, you put it into words and identifications and suddenly the symptoms are going to disappear. Lacan moved from toward fantasies and symptoms. A fantasy, unlike a dream and a symptom, is not about interpretation. The fantasy is an identification that we maintain so that we don't have to encounter the black hole, which is at the core of our worlds. A fantasy covers over a loss. It covers over trauma. For example, maybe a fantasy is, I fantasize about being a boy. Or maybe it's, I would like to be a man. That's my fantasy. I want to be seen as a man. So I want all of my nouns, anything that describes me, I want it to be in the masculine sense. It's a fantasy that a lot of hysterical men have. Or it could be like, once I get my degree from SAS, I'm not going to feel this loss or this depression or this anxiety, this trauma anymore. It's going to go away. It's a fantasy. Or maybe it's, if I just publish a book, my life will fall into place. I won't feel terrible and the fantasy, in fact, will make you not have to feel the terribleness that you already feel but don't recognize. They're all fantasies. For Lacan, the fundamental fantasy is the one that's holding your world together so that you don't confront the deep, dark pain of that hole, black hole. Fantasy is not about interpretation. Essentially, that's the point. The traversal of the fantasy, what Lacan calls the traversal of the fantasy, of the fundamental fantasy, is a traversal of the very category of truth. You confront the whole directly, without signifiers. Okay, but then what? I'm going to quote Slavoj Žižek now. If I can find where the quote ends. Okay, here we go. There's a quote from Slavoj Žižek. Žižek wrote, symptom, that's the archaic spelling of symptom. We're not talking about symptom, we're talking about symptom. Symptom is literally our only substance, the only positive support for our being. Note he says it's positive, not negative. The only point that gives consistency to the subject. Symptom answers the question, how do we account, this is the most important part from the quote. Symptom answers the question, how do we account for patients who have, beyond any doubt, gone through their fantasy, traversed their fundamental fantasy, but who still have symptoms. The symptoms still repeat, they still persist. So it's from the fantasy of truth that we're moving to the jouissance or enjoyment of the symptom. With Lacan, we get something that's not interpreted, and it's at the core of who we are. And our aim in psychoanalysis, the aim of interpretation, is toward this whole, this singular mode of enjoyment, the symptom. I'm going to come to a close here in a moment. I just have maybe 1 or 2 more things to say. This is a quote that I'd like to read with you. This is from Jacques-Alain Miller. He writes, I've adapted it a little bit for our context, but he writes or says, what takes then the place of the traversal of the fantasy, the category of truth? The reduction of truth which cannot be discovered to lying truth. If the past, not the past, the past does not take place in relation to the fantasy, but in relation to the symptom, it's not about the revelation of a truth. The point here is that symptom is not about the revelation of a truth. The past is the revelation that truth lies. That's the past of fantasy. But the past of the symptom, which means when you finish analysis at the level of the symptom, not at the level of truth, it amounts to the eternal return of its singularity in jouissance. end quote. What does it mean? It means that this quote, I listed at the end because it's a really difficult, dense quote that you can try to decipher if you like. And it summarizes everything I've said today. Everything is here in this quote. That's why I'm not going to interpret it too much, because everything I've said is condensed in here. The point is, there's in the Freudian symbolic unconscious, there's a relation to the revelation of truth. You say truth lies, the lying truth. And it's like, yes, I'm cured, in a sense. But then in now of psychoanalysis, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, you have a different unconscious that is not the symbolic unconscious, that aims at jouissance, at the symptom as that which returns, which cannot be interpreted. The whole, the black hole. You can't, there's no meaning to it. It's about enjoyment. Okay. So I was interested in this difference between prophets and saints. And what I discovered was that according to some people on the internet anyway, and I think it's true, they may or may not be reputable, but I think it's true. I'd have to do a bit more research. I'm not a religious studies scholar. A prophet speaks the word. A prophet speaks the signifier. A prophet speaks the word of God. God speaks through the prophet. The prophet is determined by the itinerary of God. That's how I would put it, spontaneously. So the prophet's on the side of truth. On the other hand, a saint establishes him or herself. It's not ordained by some duty. God does not say to the saint, you will be a saint. The saint is discovered. The saint is self-made. The saint becomes recognized through their own unique mode of being in the world, their own way of being in the world, of enjoying themselves and repeating their behaviors in the world. They don't speak a special word. They don't have any special word speaking through them. They have a particular way of being in the world. Let's stop there. We have, it's 1:40, which means we have technically 20 minutes, but if you want to leave almost 10 minutes early, we can do that, which means we have up to 20 minutes or less, depending on how much discussion we have, which is not very much time for discussion, but any questions, comments, or thoughts would be fantastic.
Well, okay, I'd like to maybe comment that for me, I just realized that every lecture I say it is hard to understand for me because at some point it became so abstract and I just lost the connection between the reality and what we are talking about. And the words, they're like have different meaning. For example, the real, symbolic, imaginary, I have to make this hard operation in order to keep in my mind what does it mean in this context. And it's like just mind-blowing a little bit by the end.
I'm happy to hear that. I'm really happy to hear that. It means you got it. I mean, you're exemplifying. You're an exemplary prophet. Because you're exemplifying precisely what it is I'm trying to say. And this is what Lacan's work aimed at. Let's just say it how it is. He wanted to fuck you up. It's what he wanted to do, which is what a Buddhist master does. I'm not saying he's Buddhist, but this is a sort of Buddhist phase in his work. He wanted to fuck you up. Because S1 and S2, as a couple, what does it indicate? It indicates the imaginary. The imaginary is when you have meaning, right? The imaginary is when you have meaning. And meaning is comfort. Meaning is comfort. And meaning is an obstacle. The imaginary is an obstacle in psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis aims at the symbolic in the time of Freud, which is the latent content. And it was trying to show the way in which our fundamental anxieties are buried in there, can be dug out, and then we can come to understand them at the level of meaning. And so in the final analysis, Freud often, though not always, made us pass through our anxiety in order to get comfort again. You face some sort of difficult period in your life, and then you're like, oh God, this is terrible. And then it's like, I can live better now. And he did have a sort of naive notion of the cure in that sense. Lacan does something different because he says, with the real, there's something that cannot be understood, that is not ever capable of being brought to the level of meaning, that is singular, and that repeats. And his writing style was exemplary of that, which means you're right. Everything you say, your anxiety is telling you the truth about what you're hearing. You're not wrong. You're absolutely correct. The meanings are changing. It's hard because when the meanings change, you lose the stability, the support that you expect in your life or in the classroom. And you say, well, I could lose everything. I could lose my grade. I could lose my mind. It's mind-blowing. Nightmares are mind-blowing. The real is mind-blowing. The clinic is aimed to show you the point at which your mind explodes. You know what happens in a black hole? Everything disappears. Everything disappears in the black hole. Have you seen the movie Interstellar? He falls into a black hole. I don't think that's what happens when you fall into a black hole. I think he died at that point. But that's the point. So it's the problem with Lacan. It's the reason why Lacan is so difficult. I think I mentioned this before. I'll say it again. You know, when you read, I don't know why I'm always quoting different religious scripture. It's like I've become a religious studies person in the last year. But when the prophet, let's say prophet Moses in Judaism, prophet Jesus in Christianity, the prophet of Islam, and so on, let's say each one, when they spoke, have you noticed they repeated the same teachings? It didn't matter who they were quite talking to. They had a truth. There was some stability there. What's really interesting is Buddha. He said different things to different people who asked the same question.
Yes,
So
it's really, really interesting.
So, for example, one person would go up to Buddha and say, Buddha, blah, 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 give me your advice. Buddha would respond and give advice. While that was going on, there's a story. I don't have the full story, but a man was hiding behind a tree. I know I've told this before, but the man was hiding behind a tree and he overheard all of this. And so he went and he asked the same question. Buddha gave him a completely different answer. All my meanings, my world doesn't make sense because you don't have the stability of the meaning that repeats. It's not the meaning that's repeating in Lacan. It's the real that's repeating. Meaning repeats for Freud. Like when Freud says, for example, dreams are expressions of wish fulfillment, you can repeat that. You can hold on to that. It's a definition. You have your dictionary and you can stand on the dictionary and then you won't fall through the hole in the floor. But with Lacan, you fall through the hole in the floor. Says something different each time, giving it a different resonance, intentionally being enigmatic, embodying the method. He's exemplary. He's embodying the method. Buddha would say something different to the person when he came. And then the lesson is that he needed to say what that person needed to hear. Yeah, let's be honest, sometimes people really need to hear the comfort of meaning. The trauma can be so intense they need it. So you give the definition. The symbolic is the domain of a signifying chain of S1 signifiers. The imaginary is the domain of meaning, and the real is where there's a hole where something falls, where there's no meaning, and so on. You have your definitions. You can hold on to them, but they're threatened by the real. Is there something in, so I just want to repeat though, Nikolai, that what you said is so important because you said the truth. In your confusion, in your consternation, in your courage, you said exactly the truth. And I would tell you that I don't think many other people would have the courage to do it in a classroom, in a university. But is there one particular topic or concept or idea that you find you want that comfort, you want a clear definition? Is there one that's really, it's stressing you out so much you need something sorted out? And that question's for anybody, not just Nikolai.
Well, actually, I remember when was the first lecture, and you said that, I guess I'm gonna quote you, I promise this is gonna be the hardest lecture. And like every time after the second lecture and the third, I'm thinking about the first as the most comfort, and it was the basis. I guess it was fine. The problems began when Lacan came, because when he wrote, he always moves to another subject, and at first he talks about Paul's story, then he jumps to another, like some analogies, I guess, and yeah, here's when I got lost, I guess.
Wow, that's, again, it's like you speak the truth. It's incredible. I'm fascinated by it. I agree with you. You're right. First thing I would say is you're right. At the beginning, I did lie to you. It was the lying truth. Second thing I would say is that, but it wasn't my intention. I really did intend for things to get easier. Look, I'm gonna be honest with you. I don't know what I'm gonna say until I say it for the most part. That's the truth. I don't know what I'm gonna say until I say it. The problem is nobody knows what they're gonna say until they say it, and yet people will plan ahead to say what they think can control what they don't want to say. And they'll do it with PowerPoint slides, they'll do it with a full script of what they're going to say word for word, and they think they can imprison the real in this way. They're not imprisoning the real. Everybody can see the four walls of their defenses, and the whole is still there. So, you know, this whole idea that I could prophesize about what was to come. I'm honest. I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know, which doesn't mean that somehow I'm some innate genius. Or what I'm saying is that I'm stupid enough. You know, I really mean it when I say I'm stupid. I'm sure you know that I mean it at this point. Like, I'm so stupid in the sense that, like, I say something and then I'm like, there it is, you know, but I'm open to it, which is what makes the psychoanalyst, I think, the psychoanalytic position a little different from the position of the university. These are two different positions. The university is really trying to build a house out of their knowledge, a dwelling space to protect them from the storms, from the cold Siberian winters. You got the warm interior. But what I've tried to show you is the interior is always connected to the exterior, such that the whole is still there in the house. But you're right. You know, one of the things that you mentioned about Freud versus Lacan, again, you speak with such focus on what the real issues are, and I hope you continue to do that in the seminars and stuff, because it's really valuable, the level at which you're engaging. Freud wrote in a way which could be it's really understood. Like, you really understand it. You feel like you do. It's such clarity. He was a master at making it seem like he was saying something that you could understand. He's a master at it. But then you go back to Freud's text and you read it again, as I am 15 years later from when I first read Freud, or whatever it is, 17 years, I guess. And you realize that there's holes in there, and he had intuitions, and there's much more complexity. As for Lacan, it's a different style. You know, he's got his own singular style as a, I would call him something like a saintly man. And he's grappling with the real directly, and he's trying to place it center stage. And what he discovers that Freud didn't have was a notion of jouissance and really the real unconscious. And when you're dealing with the real unconscious, everything falls apart. And it becomes about looking at all the pieces, you know? And so it's not a justification or a rationalization, but you're right to say that there is a difficulty there. One of the interesting things, though, sometimes this approach can make you feel, as you're listening, as a student, can make you feel as though you're following along. Like, I don't know how many of you have heard Slavoj Žižek speak. He does this really well. You're listening and he's telling jokes and you're like, oh, I feel like I get it. You're kind of following along for the ride. And then as soon as the lecture's over and you're forced to think about it, you realize you didn't understand anything. This is how I feel with Žižek, for example. This is how I sometimes feel when I read Jacques Lamelaire or Lacan as well. But I think the difference is between understanding and experience. Nikolai, you're having an experience with the text. It's a mode of being with the text, a way of living with it, the text. Scholars, they have a way of trying to understand the text. I really, really appreciate what you're saying. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? Let's say we have a minute and a half, 2 minutes or more, or 7, depending if there is a question or comment. If you have any more, just bring them to the seminar, I guess. No? Julie, do you have anything you wanted to say or add?
No, except for the lecture was amazing. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm always suspicious when she says something's amazing. Okay, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Julie. See you folks in the seminar, and sorry for bringing anxiety, Nikolai, and everybody else. We'll get through it.
It's okay. I got used to it. Thank you for the lecture.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.